Look who's back, back again. Look who's back. All right, that's me. So I'm back. So we're talking about conflict, and we're talking about how the story had some supernatural conflict in it. At least I think there's a little bit of it, and how the waves and the storm are described, and how we get these strange characters and strange places, and this just extra level of mystery. So I think that all adds to some of the supernatural feeling. All right. So let's see. What else can we talk about here? Um, Tidal wave. If you don't know what a tidal wave is, probably what happened, because this does happen. The storm was so strong, the winds were so strong, it actually caused the ocean to recede. And then at some point, the water has to go somewhere. And so it just builds up and piles up. And this tidal wave becomes huge and crashes onto the sand. And what we have here is this little picture of this kid running away from the tidal wave. Sadly, that's what happened to Kay. Kay wasn't paying attention, and the tidal wave came, and it crashed onto the beach, and it swept Kay up into the tidal wave, which of course was tragic. All right, what I think is interesting is the description of the tidal wave. And we're looking at the idea now, that word imagery. On page 7, you see the narrator, the seventh man, is yelling, "Hurry, Kay, get out of there." This time my voice worked. The rumbling had stopped. I realized Kay heard my shouting and looked up, but it was too late. A wave, like a huge snake. That's imagery. You should be able to close your eyes and see it. And I did my best here to find some pictures that would kind of match. And so we have this curve of the snake and this curve of the wave, right? And so you can close your eyes and you can almost imagine this wave kind of growing up and tilting over and just getting bigger and bigger and bigger with its kind of crested head here. All right, that's imagery. Okay, as you're evaluating conflict, you stop every once in a while and think, what has mostly happened in this story so far? And honestly, not a lot has actually happened. The storm comes, the typhoon, the description of the typhoon, and then it's calm, they go out to the beach, and then the wave, and we get more of the wave. And so simply like statistics, if you just stop and think, what is most of this story about, you'll understand that the story, the conflict here, is about nature, about the power of the typhoon, about the power of the wave. So just stop and think about that sometimes. What is really mostly being talked about? Does the narrator fight with Kay? Nope. Does the seventh man fight with his parents? Nope. Later on, it even goes out of its way to say how his parents and Kay's parents were so nice to him. So the seventh man doesn't really fight with anybody. The seventh man talks about how he has an older brother, but not much of a relationship there. Instead, we get a lot of the storm, a lot of the storm, a lot of the storm, a lot of the wave, a lot of the wave, a lot of the wave. So think about that. Character versus nature so far. So as we move into the second half of the story, pay attention. What is most of the focus about? What is the seventh man mostly telling us about? All right. Okay. As we move into the final stretches, we find the narrator struggling with himself. And so look at all of these passages I grabbed. I knew the truth. I knew I could have saved Kay if I had tried. I knew the truth, and I could have done it if I had done it. I was overcome with fear. The terror was in my bones. Now, terror, fear, these are things inside of our own minds. They might be from external factors, external forces, but for the seventh man, he says this fear was here inside of him. Something was permeating his flesh. He felt this change within him. Permeate means going through. He could feel the change going through him. The deep darkness, this fear, this terror, had vanished. There was no longer anything for me to fear. And it says, I am now trying to start life over again. So in the second half of the story, we leave the conflict with nature and we find conflict with the seventh man's own self. It's all about how he feels and how he reacts to his feelings and how his fear cripples his life and how he eventually learns to let go of that fear. So that's the conflict. That's the character versus self for the conflict. Character versus nature, and the second half is character versus self. Those are the two major conflicts we see. All right. So, does he overcome his fear? Kind of already talked about that a little bit. Yeah, he does. So we see this growth and this progress of a character, which we love. We love it in movies and TV shows and books when the characters grow and they learn and they become better and better people. That's what we should all want in our own lives. We mess up, we screw up, we might feel really bad. The next day we try and do better. We fight with our brother, character versus character. We learn our lesson. We learn to love our brother, right? We get angry at our mom and dads in our own minds. We feel bad about ourselves. And the next day, we learn to show patience and kindness and love and self-forgiveness, and we get better, okay? Character versus self, he does overcome his own fear. Good for him. All right. Now, I know I jumped ahead a little bit. That's okay. So now I'm going to kind of draw back a little bit. He moves to Nagano, which is a real place on the Japanese island, and you can see here that it's right in the middle of the island. Why do you think that the seventh man would move to the middle of the island? All right. I also want to talk briefly about the punctuation, and I know this seems a little bit weird, but as you're reading it, okay, we have this parenthesis here on page 7, soundlessly, in my memory at least, the image is soundless. It rose up behind K to block out the sky. First thing I want to point out here is the parentheses, and listen to how I read it because you need to read punctuation. Soundlessly, in my memory at least, the image is soundless. It rose up behind K. It's an aside. The main thought is how it rose up behind K, but the secondary thought, the background thought is, well, it seemed like it was soundless. In my mind, it was soundless. And this is how we talk. This is how we share things. We'll talk about things and we'll go, oh yeah, let me add this detail, and then let me go back to the main point. So read the punctuation, understand how the punctuation works. Because if you read it soundlessly, in my memory, at least the image is soundless, it rose up behind K, you're probably not going to understand what's being talked about. So pause, read the punctuation in these parentheses separately as its own thought, and then connect that thought to the bigger thought. All right, and the next here is the punctuation of simply the periods. To block out the sky, period, end of sentence. K, period, abbreviation, right? It's not really a period, it's the end of the sentence. So don't get confused when you see the periods back to back like that. Recognize that K is the name, K period. Every time you see K period doesn't necessarily mean it's the end of the sentence. So the next one I wanted to talk about a little bit is the colon there, right? And that terrible grin he had fixed me with, that too could have been an accident of angle or light or shadow, not a conscious act on K's part. Okay. So what we get here is, and that terrible grin he had fixed me with. Terrible grin, right? Like the mouth is spread in a smile, but it's not really a smile. Whatever that looks like. Yeah, that might have been terrifying. I'm sorry. So, this colon. What's happening here is those two dots essentially are saying what comes next explains the first part. So the terrible grin is what we're talking about. But that grin could have actually not been a terrible grin. Maybe it was just light playing with it. Maybe it was shadow. Maybe K wasn't even aware of what his face looked like. Maybe the movement of the water and the waves and the sun, maybe that was what was making his face move. And maybe the seventh man misunderstood what he thought was his horrible smile, and it was just nothing. And it didn't matter. right? But the point is those colons. And what the colons here are saying is what comes next explains the beginning part here. Almost like a list, right? Like it's continuing the thought. It's just some fun punctuation to be aware of. All right. Illusions. Why should you be participants in the great conversation? I'm going to back up just before we get to that. Just talk briefly. So let's see here. The narrator says he knew the truth. He probably could have saved Kay if he had tried, page 10. I think it's talking about the strength of our own fears, right? Although we're talking about the seventh man's fears in his own life, the bigger idea that all of us can connect to is the idea of general fear in our life and how fear can control us and fear can prevent us from doing good things. It does prevent us from doing bad things sometimes, like I'm scared to jump off this cliff, I'm scared to try a spicy food. Maybe it helps us not do foolish things, but it also can prevent us from doing other things. So the power of fear in our lives. Terror in his bones. We talked about that a little bit, how the fear controls him. All right. So we kind of talked about all this stuff here. So basically it's talking about in these middle pages here that the seventh man grows up, he moves away from his family, and the fear just kind of stunts his life. He says, yeah, he had some friends. Yeah, he had a few girlfriends over the time, but his life never really flourished. He never grew. He never had a fulfilling big life. Mostly he was afraid. When he finally travels home, having looked at Kay's watercolors, he looks at the watercolors and he sees life. And he sees beauty. And he remembers Kay. And remember how Kay was described at the very beginning? That Kay was a sweet and pure-hearted boy. I think what happens is the seventh man recognizes the seventh man's fear is unfair. And Kay, his friend, would not have wanted him to hold on to this fear. Kay, his friend, was a good person, a sweet, artistic person who shared beautiful things. All right. And that's where we get to this idea, page 14, the darkness vanished. He's able to reconcile with this. He overcomes his fear, and he tries to start his life over again, which is interesting because now I want to know even more. Why is he with these people telling these stories? Right? All right, that takes us now to the very last part, illusions. Why should you participate in the great conversation? Why should you read old speeches? Why should you read old stories? So that you can understand things. The tricky part about illusions is if you don't know what they're alluding to, you miss them completely. So Franklin D. Roosevelt was the president of the United States, and during the Great Depression, he said that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And so at the end, when the seventh man says, oh, there's fear, all right, it comes to us in many different forms at different times and overwhelms us. But the most frightening thing we can do at such times is to turn our backs on it, to close our eyes. For then we take the most precious thing inside us and surrender it to something else. Okay. When the president said we have nothing to fear but fear itself, what he means is don't let the fear of what's going on in the economy, don't let your fear of what's going on in the world paralyze you and prevent you from doing things. Here at the end, the most important thing is to not give ourselves over to other powers. Don't give in to fear. Don't let fear control your life the way it controlled my life. All right. It's overall a very simple story. The seventh man is telling his story. His story is of the typhoon and tidal wave killing his best friend. And then he grows up into a man, racked with guilt and fear and paralyzed with fear. And then he comes home and he finds peace because he's able to let go of the fear. And he says that that fear controlled his life, but it controls him no longer. All right. I enjoy that story. I enjoy it for some of the mystery. I enjoy it for the simplicity. I enjoy it for the beautiful descriptions, the imagery. I wouldn't say beautiful because it's powerful and deadly, but still, I like where it comes from. So, all right. I hope you enjoyed the story. We're left with this. In my case, that something was the wave. So what do you think that it refers to? What did the wave do to the seventh man? Did it paralyze him in fear? Did it rob him of most of his life? What paralyzes you? What can rob you of your joy in life? What conflicts come your way and try and prevent you from being happy and fulfilled? So I think that about sums it up, ladies and gents. We talked a lot about character versus nature, character versus supernatural, and character versus self. Those are the elements of conflict I see in this story. And lastly, I hope you enjoyed it. So there's that. All right. Glad we were able to finish that up. See you around.